Sienna Thorne counted the remaining shillings twice on the narrow table beside the apothecary window, then tied them back into a square of muslin and set the bundle beneath her account book, as if neatness alone could make the sum larger. One trunk stood open against the wall because there was no wardrobe in the room and no second room to hide the truth. Her wedding band, plain gold, caught the late light when she reached for the ink. She had married at dawn with 2 servants as witnesses, and by evening she had learned exactly what her mother considered the market value of disobedience. Below her, Merrow Street pressed against the glass in carts and boots and the smell of damp rope. The old apothecary had been a respectable shop 20 years earlier, before the proprietor died and his nephew neglected it into patched shutters and shelves that leaned. Elias had taken the upper floor at a modest rent and called it sufficient. Sienna had called it home without rehearsal, because the alternative had been to return to Dawson House and sign the annulment papers already prepared in her mother's solicitor's hand. She had not asked Elias whether he had been afraid that morning. She had not asked herself. She had put on a simple travelling dress, stepped into the chapel before the first bell, and spoken vows in a voice that did not tremble. The first Monday note arrived folded with mathematical precision, delivered by a footman who had served her since childhood and now looked at the brass plate instead of her face. She broke the seal standing in the stairwell with the smell of lavender cordial rising from the shop below. The sentence was short, flat, and perfectly legible. You will petition for annulment. Your allowance remains suspended until compliance. No signature was needed. Lenora Dawson's authority sat inside every letter form, narrow and disciplined as if sentiment itself had been bred out of the line. She did not carry the note upstairs at once. She tucked it beneath the stair rail, climbed back to her rooms, and poured tea into 2 cups from a chipped white pot. 1 cup she set by Elias's ledger. The other she carried down to Nora, the maid who swept the empty shop for 3 pence and lunch. Nora startled when Sienna entered the back room, then bobbed a curtsy so deep it looked almost painful. Sienna set the cup beside her and asked whether the boil on her wrist had eased with the salve. Nora blinked, then nodded too quickly. Everyone at Dawson House had treated servants as furniture unless a tray was dropped. Sienna had never learned that grammar. By the second Monday of her marriage, the notes came with an enclosure from Mr. Halbridge, her mother's solicitor, written on thick cream stock meant to imply permanence. As a married woman without independent disbursement, you have no practical standing absent family support. Petition remains advised. His clerk delivered that one to Merrow Street and waited in the doorway for a reply, gloved hands clasped behind his back, as if he had arrived to assess inventory rather than carry pressure. Sienna wrote her answer on the reverse in 3 words, and returned it without invitation to sit. Not at present. The clerk read it, blinked, and left with visible discomfort, as though refusal were a language he had heard but never been expected to translate. The injustice did not come as shouting. It came as arithmetic. Invitations withdrew in courteous phrases. Dressmakers delayed deliveries, pending account clarification. A bookseller who had once sent new volumes to Dawson House each quarter asked for payment in advance and did not apologize. Sienna spent mornings balancing accounts for a seamstress on Clove Lane and an aging bookseller on Pelham Court, fingers ink-stained, cuffs mended where ribbon had frayed. She learned to stretch soup with pearl barley and to cut lamp oil with discipline. She learned that humiliation had weight. She felt it each time a woman she had once greeted at assemblies turned instead to speak to someone else. Still, she did not return the ring. On the 3rd Monday, she went when summoned. Dawson House smelled of beeswax and orange peel, exactly as it had when she was 12, and afraid to blot a copybook page. The hall clock struck 10 as she crossed the marble, her boots clean but plainly resoled, and the butler led her to the morning room where Lenora sat by the fire with untouched chocolate and a stack of correspondence. Her mother wore dove-grey silk and pearls that had belonged to Sienna's grandmother, as if inheritance could be displayed while affection was withheld. Lenora did not rise. Her eyes were pale and dry, the colour of winter glass. They revealed nothing except the habit of command. "Sit, if you wish," she said, though there was no warmth in the permission. "Mr. Halbridge will join us in a moment." Sienna remained standing. "I have little time, Mother." "One creates time for correction." Mr. Halbridge entered with a leather folio under his arm, bowed to Lenora first, and then inclined his head towards Sienna, as one might acknowledge a neighbour at a funeral. He removed a document, set it on the table, and placed a pen beside it with careful alignment. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, voice professionally neutral, "this is a petition for annulment on grounds of precipitous consent and unsuitability of station. If signed today, your allowance may be partially restored at your mother's discretion." Lenora lifted her cup and set it down again without drinking. "You have made your point, Sienna. A week was childish rebellion. 3 weeks has become embarrassment. Sign, and we shall conclude this." Sienna looked at the paper but did not touch it. There, in black strokes, her marriage had already been rendered administrative error. She could almost hear the drawing rooms of London composing their verdict. Impulsive daughter. Corrected. She kept her hands at her sides so no one would see the minute tremor in her left thumb. "I will not sign," she said. Halbridge cleared his throat. "You misunderstand the practical conditions. Without disbursement, your household cannot sustain itself. The gentleman in question possesses no independent estate sufficient to protect you from—" "The gentleman in question has a name." Lenora's mouth moved, almost a smile, though not with amusement. "Do not become theatrical. You married a clerk from my own estate office in order to wound me. The effect is limited." Sienna met her mother's gaze. "Then you are unharmed." The silence that followed was not loud, but it had edges. Halbridge shifted his weight. Lenora turned one pearl ring a quarter turn around her finger. "A year," Lenora said at last, each word placed as if she were dictating household instructions. "If you persist 1 year, perhaps hunger will instruct where affection failed. Until then, all allowances remain suspended. Staff are not to extend Dawson credit to your address. Carriages are not to be sent. This is not punishment. It is structure." Sienna could feel her pulse in her throat. She wanted to say that structure had another name when used against a daughter who had chosen for herself. She wanted to ask whether love had ever entered the room between them in any year of her life. She said neither. She picked up the unsigned petition, folded it once, and laid it back on Halbridge's folio. "As you decide," she said. 4 words. Enough. Lenora glanced at the butler waiting by the door. "See that Mrs. Thorne is shown out." Mrs. Thorne. Not Sienna, not daughter. A title used as dismissal. She walked through the long hall without haste, though she could feel the heat in her face and the raw sting behind her eyes. She did not cry in the carriage court. She did not cry in the street. At the side entrance, young Elsie from the upstairs nursery stood with a basket of linens and shifted awkwardly when she saw her. Sienna took the heavier corner of the basket and carried it to the laundry passage without comment, then pressed a coin into Elsie's hand because the girl's shoes had split at the seam. Elsie stared at the coin as if it were a confession. When she reached Merrow Street, dusk had already settled in the narrow gaps between roofs. Elias sat at the table by the window with ledgers open, sleeves rolled, his grey eyes following her face once, and then dropping to the page as if granting privacy rather than demanding report. He was quiet in the way of men who had learned not to spend words where action could do better. "They sent another letter," he said, sliding the folded note toward her. She broke the seal. The same line, the same hand. "You will petition for annulment. Your allowance remains suspended until compliance." Sienna set the paper down and removed her gloves, finger by finger. "Then they are consistent." Elias watched her, expression unreadable. "Do you wish me to answer them?" "No." She sat opposite him, opened the seamstress's account ledger and dipped her pen. "We will answer with time." Outside, cartwheels rattled over loose stone, and a vendor called the evening prices for onions and turnips. Inside, lamplight settled over ink, paper, and 2 cups of tea gone cold. The world that had named her protected yesterday had closed its doors in orderly sequence. Yet she was still here, ring on her hand, spine straight, writing figures that would keep this small household upright another week. On the next Monday morning, the footman came again. She took the note at the stairwell, thanked him by name, and closed the door with steady hands. The footman's gloves were still bright from polish when Sienna broke the seal and read the same sentence for the 4th time. The ink neither heavier nor lighter, as if her mother had instructed the pen itself never to reveal a mood. She folded the paper along its existing crease, returned it to its envelope, and set it on the narrow shelf by the stair window where unpaid bills and market lists waited in a disciplined stack. Then she carried the coal scuttle to the hearth, shook out the ashpan, and measured the morning by work instead of outrage. Elias looked up from his ledger when she entered, not at the note first, but at her face. His eyes were grey, clear, and habitually reserved, the eyes of a man who observed before he spoke. "The same?" he asked. "The same." He nodded once. "Then we proceed." They ate bread with apple preserve and weak tea, because milk had risen in price again. And after breakfast, Sienna tied on her cuffs, wrapped her account books in oilcloth, and crossed Merrow Street before the shop awnings were fully opened. Mrs. Bell on Clove Lane sat at her cutting table with spectacles low on her nose, and 3 apprentices bent over hems, in a silence broken only by shears and thread teeth. Sienna checked measurements against invoices, adjusted entries where ribbon had been charged twice by the wholesaler, and discovered 6pence hidden as a carrying fee in a parcel that had never left the lane. She marked the error in a steady hand and circled it for contest. When Mrs. Bell offered to postpone payment, Sienna shook her head and accepted coins counted directly into her palm, then tucked them into a separate pocket from household funds, because confusion, once invited, multiplied. On Pelham Court, the bookseller Mr. Pike had wrapped his fingers in wool against a persistent ache, and could no longer climb his own ladder without pausing on each rung. Sienna sorted his quarterlies by subscriber district, copied renewal notices, and wrote 3 letters to patrons who had forgotten accounts older than courtesy allowed. She addressed each by name and title, each line formal, each reminder impossible to misunderstand. By Thursday of that week, routine had set itself like plaster. Morning tea for 2. Figures before noon, errands through lanes where acquaintances now measured recognition like a scarce commodity. A midday return to Merrow Street with bread, onions, and whatever greens could be bargained from bruised baskets. 1 cup carried downstairs to Nora, whose boil had dried to a pale seam because Sienna remembered to ask the apothecary's nephew for better salve. Evening accounts by lamplight, Elias at one end of the table, Sienna at the other, their knees occasionally brushing beneath the wood, when both reached for the same docket and neither remarking upon it. The social world answered her marriage with small exclusions that required no signatures. A cream card arrived from Lady Cresswell's house, edges gilt, script elegant. The family dinner this Friday has been reduced due to intimate numbers. Sienna read it while standing by the post slot, turned the card over and used the blank reverse to tally butcher prices from memory. At the fishmonger, the woman behind the counter greeted her with trained warmth, then asked for cash, before wrapping cod that had once been charged monthly to Dawson House without question. At the draper, a bolt of blue muslin she had admired since spring was suddenly reserved for another client whom no one named. She did not plead for restored courtesies. She adjusted. That afternoon she sat at the table with a basket of mending balanced against her knee and turned one of Elias's shirts inside out to reinforce the cuff seam where ink and wear had thinned the fabric. The stitch was not elegant, but it held. In the same hour she re-hemmed her own walking dress by candle stub, then copied 2 pages of Mr. Pike's annual inventory, while stew thickened slowly on the stove. She had been taught music and French and the choreography of receiving guests. Now she learned that domestic economy had its own grammar, as strict as Latin and less forgiving of errors. On the next Monday, Mr. Halbridge's clerk came instead of the footman, face pinched by cold, hat brim shining with mist. He held out a folded memorandum and waited in the doorway with the patient posture of a man sent not to discuss, but to record. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "Mr. Halbridge requests confirmation that you have considered the petition terms and your mother's conditions." Sienna opened the memorandum on the hall table. It was brief, legal, and almost courteous in its refusal to acknowledge dignity where leverage could replace it. She took up a pencil, wrote across the lower margin, and handed it back. No alteration. The clerk glanced down and swallowed. "Shall I indicate that this is final?" "You may indicate accuracy." He paused, uncertain whether he had been corrected or dismissed, then bowed and left, with his polished boots leaving damp crescents on the stone step. Sienna closed the door and scrubbed the marks with a rag before they dried. Behind her, Nora held a tray and watched in embarrassed silence until Sienna took one side of the load and carried it to the kitchen without ceremony. By the second week of October, she had learned exactly how many evenings a pound of coal could stretch if the kitchen door remained closed, and the upstairs windows were latched before dusk. She learned to skim fat from broth and save it for frying onions 2 days later. She learned which creditors became kinder when addressed with transparent numbers, and which became sharper when they smelled delay. She learned that hardship had less to do with hunger than with the constant labor of deciding which need could wait. And still, there were moments that held. A carter on Merrow Street dropped a crate and split his thumbnail. Sienna fetched lint and bandage from the apothecary shelves, while others stepped around him. Nora's brother came with fever and no coin for tonic. Sienna recalculated lamp oil, bought only half the week's measure and paid for medicine with the remainder. When Mrs. Bell's youngest apprentice pricked her finger and burst into tears over stained silk, Sienna sat her on a stool, showed her how to lift the spot with milk and salt, and said nothing of panic. Kindness cost minutes and money she did not have. She spent both as if they were dues to a principle older than comfort. One evening, as she shook crumbs from the tablecloth into the yard pail, her hand struck the brass edge of her trunk where it stood, still half open against the wall, for want of furniture. She knelt to close it properly and found, beneath winter gloves and a folded shawl, a small velvet case she had not touched since the morning she left Dawson House. For a moment, she did not place it. Then, memory aligned. Her grandmother's brooch, sapphire set in seed pearls, slipped into her bag by instinct when she packed in the dark before dawn, not for theft, but because it had been the one piece her mother could not make feel cold. She opened the case, The stone caught lamplight and returned it with stern clarity. Elias came in from the stair with a parcel of copied forms under his arm. He stopped when he saw the brooch in her hand. "You could sell it," he said quietly. "No one on Merrow Street would ask questions." "I know." She closed the case and set it on the ledger stack. "That is why I cannot." He did not argue. He set his parcel down, unbuttoned his coat, and stood for a moment as though weighing language against silence. "If you return it," he said at last, "they may call it admission. They call me what they please already." His gaze held hers measured, searching for the fracture she refused to display. "Do you wish me to accompany you?" "No, I will go in daylight and by the front hall." He inclined his head. "As you judge, Mrs. Thorne." The next morning she dressed in her plainest brown walking dress, pinned her collar with a simple clasp, and tucked the velvet case into her reticule beside the market list, and a pencil worn short by use. Dawson House rose from its terrace exactly as it always had, pale stone and ironwork and polished windows, reflecting a city that rewarded appearance with obedience. She gave her name to the butler before he could pretend uncertainty, and stepped inside without waiting to be announced. The hall smelled of wax and citrus and expensive quiet. Somewhere above, a clock struck 11. A maid she did not recognize took her cloak with hesitant hands, eyes flicking to the re-hemmed edge of Sienna's skirt, and then away. Sienna asked for her mother's housekeeper first. If the brooch changed hands formally, no claim of concealment could follow. The maid murmured that Mrs. Keats was in the west wing and would be fetched, then gestured towards the morning room. Sienna chose the corridor instead and moved toward the study, where business papers were received and logged. The study door stood almost closed. Voices came through the narrow gap, clear enough that she recognized both speakers before the second sentence. Lenora's tone was level, almost bored. "A year of discomfort will correct her." Mr. Halbridge answered in his dry legal cadence. "Provided she does not secure independent representation. She has married a clerk and rented rooms above a failed apothecary. Representation is a luxury. Endurance is finite." There was the scrape of paper, a pause. Then Lenora again, each word clipped to utility. "Continue weekly notices. Continue suspension of all household credit. If she attempts to sell family pieces, notify me before purchase is completed." Sienna's fingers closed around the velvet case until the edge pressed into her palm. Heat rose under her skin, then drained so quickly she felt the corridor tilt for one disorienting heartbeat. She set her free hand against the wall paneling and breathed through her nose. Steady, silent. Not surprise. Confirmation. She stepped back from the door before either voice shifted toward the hall and turned toward the entry passage with measured pace, as though she had heard nothing more significant than a dinner menu. Her throat felt dry enough to bruise. The brooch case in her hand had become absurdly heavy. At the foot of the main stair, a man stood beside the long console table beneath her father's portrait, coat unremarkable, hat in hand, 3 ledgers stacked against his side. Elias. For a fraction of a second she saw him as the household would see him, the estate clerk waiting on instruction, posture correct, expression composed. Then she saw what had not belonged in her former understanding. The ledgers were not estate rent books, but legal folios bound in dark calf, edges tagged with narrow slips, one margin marked in Latin abbreviations she recognized from Mr. Halbridge's office copies. His cuff bore a faint smear of red wax, the kind used for chamber seals. A groom crossing the hall slowed, stared, and looked away with unusual haste. Elias met her eyes. No surprise crossed his face, only an alert stillness, as if he had expected this intersection, and was prepared to stand inside it without flinching. "Sienna," he said, formal because the walls had ears. "I had thought to call for you at noon." She looked from his face to the ledgers and back, hearing in her mind Lenora's sentence like the strike of metal against stone. A year of discomfort will correct her. The world she had been navigating by touch had gained a second map she had not been shown. He shifted the folios to his other arm and lowered his voice by a degree that made the words private, though they stood in open view. "You went to the study." It was not accusation. It was fact. "I went to return property," she replied. "I received instruction instead." For the first time since she had entered the house, something moved in his expression. Not pity, not alarm. Something sharper and quieter than either. He took one step nearer, enough that she could see the fine grain of fatigue at the corners of his eyes. "Then I will ask plainly," he said. "Do you still wish to fight?" "Yes," Sienna said. The word left her mouth steady, though her fingers still pressed hard against the velvet case in her reticule. "I do." Elias inclined his head once, as if she had confirmed a ledger figure rather than chosen a line that could not be uncrossed. He shifted the folios under his arm and glanced toward the far end of the hall, where the butler had paused near the dining-room doors with studied inattention. "Then we leave by the east passage," he said. "There are fewer ears." She should have argued that she did not require guidance through the house where she had been raised. Instead, she turned with him, matching his pace, and felt the old geometry of Dawson House rearrange itself around two facts that could no longer be separated. Her mother had planned the deprivation with administrative calm, and her husband held legal books no estate clerk should have touched. At the bend toward the service corridor, Mrs. Keats appeared with a ring of keys at her waist and a linen ledger in hand. She stopped when she saw Sienna and folded into a curtsy that carried both habit and discomfort. "Mrs. Thorne." Sienna drew the velvet case from her reticule and placed it on the nearest console table between them. "My grandmother's brooch was packed in error on my wedding morning. Please, enter it back into the Dawson inventory under your own signature." Mrs. Keats blinked, then opened the case just enough to verify the sapphire and pearls. Her mouth tightened with something that looked briefly like relief. "I will record it at once, madam." "Thank you." Sienna did not look toward the study door. She did not look toward the morning room where her mother might still be dictating terms of correction. She walked beside Elias through the east passage and out into the stone-paved mews, where the air smelled of horse and wet rope and a city carrying on as if nothing had shifted at all. Only when the side gate shut behind them did he speak again. "You heard enough," he said. "I heard what was intended." She kept her gaze ahead toward the street beyond the mews. A year of discomfort, weekly notices, credit suspended, monitoring of family pieces. It was comprehensive. It was coercive. The bluntness of the words struck her more sharply than Lenora's practiced coldness had. Coercive belonged to statutes and petitions, not drawing rooms and maternal duty, yet it fit with a precision she could not deny. They turned onto the main road, boots striking uneven stone in an alternating rhythm. He carried the folios in silence for half a block, then stopped outside a stationer's window and set them on the sill to free one hand. From the inside pocket of his coat he took a folded list and held it toward her. "These were brought to me this morning," he said. "Estate matters forwarded from Dawson offices for routine signature. One item concerns a tenancy on Merrow Street. I had not acted." Sienna took the paper. Near the bottom, in a narrower hand than the rest, an order instructed immediate repossession of a two-room dwelling for non-payment of 2 months' rent by Mrs. Harriet Vale, widow. Sienna knew the name. Mrs. Vale mended gloves near the bridge and had once stitched a torn hem for Nora without charging for the thread. Repossess, Sienna said. In October. Elias waited. She has no one in town, Sienna said. If you remove her now, she has no coal account and no winter place arranged. 2 missed rents do not justify street exposure. You direct that the order be stayed? The language jarred her, official and exact, yet he asked as if her judgment had standing. She looked up. His grey eyes were steady, unreadable, attentive to her answer and to nothing else. I direct, she said carefully, that it be void. A pause. Then he gave the smallest nod. As you judge, Mrs. Thorne. No warmth softened the sentence, no smile transformed it into reassurance. Even so, something in her chest eased by a narrow measure, as if a door she had not known she was bracing against had opened 1 inch. She handed the list back. He folded it once and returned it to his pocket without commentary. They walked the rest of the way to Merrow Street in practical silence, and if their shoulders came near enough once for the sleeves of their coats to brush, neither remarked upon it. The following morning, Sienna crossed to the back court with a basket of invoices and found Mrs. Vale on the apothecary steps, gloved hands knotted over a worn reticule, eyes red-rimmed with fatigue rather than tears. Sienna set the basket down at once. Mrs. Vale? The widow rose halfway, uncertain whether to curtsy. Beg pardon, madam. I came to ask for Mr. Thorne. A notice was posted yesterday. Then another paper arrived after dark. I do not understand which one is true. Sienna held out her hand. The second paper bore new language, 3 clauses inserted in disciplined script. Tenancy converted to seasonal terms. Arrears distributed across 6 months. Eviction, stayed absent, willful damage. At the bottom sat Elias's signature, plain and controlled, and beneath it a witnessing line signed by a solicitor from Pelham Court, whose name Sienna recognized from Halbridge's circles. Mrs. Vale spoke in a low rush. They said I might remain if I kept to the revised schedule. They said the first instalment was already posted to account and I could repay in labour records if coin failed 1 week. I did not ask charity, madam. Only— It is not charity, Sienna said. It is a proper contract. Mrs. Vale's shoulders dropped, as if a weight had been shifted to a place she could carry. She thanked Sienna twice, then gathered herself and left, with a pace no longer edged by panic. When Sienna turned back toward the stair, Elias stood just inside the doorway with a bundle of copied forms in his hand. He had evidently heard enough to understand what had passed, yet he did not claim credit or seek acknowledgement. You altered the tenancy overnight, she said. You directed that the order be void. That clause structure was not in the original register. No. She waited, expecting elaboration. None came. He adjusted the forms under his arm and moved aside so she could pass first. The moment could have ended there. It nearly did. Yet as she stepped by, he said, very quietly, "You were correct about the winter risk." 4 words, no ornament. They warmed her more than the stove had that morning. By the end of that week, their mornings had taken on a rhythm shaped by disagreement. Sienna sat at the table by the apothecary window with account books open, arguing for repairs she deemed necessary. Elias sat opposite with estate abstracts and margin notes, asking which expense could be delayed without compounding later loss. She insisted that cracked pump handles caused illness downriver. He countered with timber prices and transport lag. She answered with names of households and dates of fever. They did not raise voices. They did not yield theatrically. They moved numbers, crossed out assumptions and built decisions line by line until one of them marked final figures in ink. On Tuesday, she pressed for a reduced levy on 3 market stalls after flood damage spoiled their stock. Elias listened, asked 2 brief questions about precedents, then said, If reductions are granted, neighbouring stalls will petition equal treatment. They may petition, she said. We can distinguish flood loss from ordinary poor sales. He studied her for a beat that felt less like challenge and more like calibration. Then draft the distinction. She drafted it. He copied it into formal language that same evening, his script clean and narrow, each clause balanced as though he had trained for precisely this architecture of thought. She noticed again the marginal abbreviations in Latin, references to authorities no clerk in routine estate service needed. She noticed and said nothing. 3 days later, they walked to the parish office to secure signatures on revised market terms. The streets smelled of damp straw and chestnut smoke. At each door, Elias waited while Sienna explained the changes to stallholders who had begun, cautiously, to trust that she spoke and returned as promised. One man in a butcher's apron tried to hand his signed form directly to Elias, eyes skipping over Sienna as though she were merely accompanying him. Elias did not take it. "To my wife," he said. "She carries the register." The butcher blinked, then corrected himself with awkward haste. Sienna accepted the paper, entered the signature, and moved on without rebuke. Still, the small correction lodged in her thoughts for the rest of the walk. That evening, as they crossed the square toward Merrow Street, bells from St. James's marked the hour and a light rain began, fine as wire. Elias removed his coat and offered it without speech. She hesitated only long enough to see that his shirt sleeves were already damp. "You will be cold. I am accustomed." She took the coat and put it on because practicality outweighed ceremony. It carried the faint scent of paper, sealing wax, and cedar soap. They walked the remaining distance under one umbrella borrowed from the apothecary landing, shoulders nearly touching, neither speaking until they reached the stair. Inside, while Nora banked the kitchen fire below, Sienna spread the day's forms to dry and saw, at the top of one page, an annotation Elias had written and then crossed through. Audi alteram partem. Here the other side, a principle, not a calculation, not a clerk's shorthand. The first week of November brought longer errands, and the return of carriage travel neither of them could truly afford, but could no longer avoid. 2 petitions required in-person filing at the registry office near Chancery Lane, and documents this sensitive could not be trusted to ordinary post. Elias hired the least expensive carriage available, springs worn and window latch loose, and they rode opposite each other with the document case between them like a third passenger. At the first office, a junior clerk took their papers, scanned the signatures, then looked up sharply at Elias. "Mr. Thorne," he said before catching himself. "Sir, I did not expect—" He stopped, glanced at Sienna, and shifted his tone. "Please wait in the antechamber while I obtain the register." When he had gone, Sienna sat beside the narrow fireplace and watched Elias remove his gloves, finger by finger, expression unchanged. "He knew you," she said. "I have filed there before." "Frequently?" "Enough." The answer was true and strategically incomplete. She could feel both aspects of it. She examined his profile as he turned toward the window. The stillness under pressure, the economy of movement, the refusal to decorate a statement when fewer words would hold. The man she had married at dawn and the man the clerk had almost addressed as Sir overlapped without fully matching. At the second office, an older registrar with ink on both cuffs accepted their packet and said to Elias, in a low voice not meant to carry, "Your memorandum on equitable tenancy has been circulated. There is resistance." "Resistance is procedural," Elias replied, "not substantive." The registrar's brows lifted. "You speak as though you intend to argue this yourself." "Documents first." The registrar noticed Sienna then and offered a formal nod. No apology, no explanation. Elias turned slightly, opening space for her at the counter before stepping back. She signed where required, each stroke deliberate. As they left, she could feel questions gathering like static beneath her collar. She did not ask them. Not yet. By mid-November, their work extended beyond daylight. They walked after supper to collect declarations from tenants whose landlords had begun inserting unlawful fees. And on more than one step, she watched Elias read an agreement once and identify, without hesitation, where a clause had been altered to trap the signer. He never announced discovery with flourish. He tapped the line, stated the defect, and offered a lawful replacement in plain language. Men who had dismissed him at first as a diligent messenger fell silent and listened. One cold evening they stopped at a narrow house off Pritchard Lane, where an elderly couple feared forfeiture over a disputed boundary marker. Sienna had expected a simple misunderstanding. Instead, she found 2 decades of muddled deeds and one recent insertion that would have stripped their kitchen garden in spring. While she took statements, Elias stood by the hearth, reading by firelight, then asked for paper. He wrote for 10 uninterrupted minutes, paused only once to consult an older deed, and handed the page to Sienna. "File this with both dates attached," he said. "It compels review." She skimmed the draft and felt a pulse of recognition so clear it startled her. The argument was elegant, tight and humane. It defended rights without humiliating the opposing party. It solved the dispute while preserving face for officials who had erred. This was not clerical competence. This was training shaped by discipline and used with restraint. When they stepped back into the lane, frost beginning to silver the cobbles, she tucked the draft into the leather case and kept walking. He waited for her to speak. She did not because she lacked questions, because each answer seemed to belong to a structure he was building in careful stages, and she had learned enough from her mother's machinery to distrust the timing of revelations forced by anger. 3 days passed before another Monday note arrived from Dawson House. The same sentence, the same command dressed as inevitability. Sienna read it at the stair window, folded it once, and slid it beneath the paperweight on their table. Elias watched from across the room. "Do you wish to answer?" he asked. She met his gaze. "We are answering." He held her eyes for a moment, then returned to the ledger before him. "Then we continue." They did. Breakfast disputes, evening signatures, registry queues, and long returns through streets that had begun to treat their shared purpose as fact rather than performance. He let her argue each principle to its edge, testing her reasoning with brief objections, yielding in words, then strengthening her position in practice with instruments she still could not fully name. She noticed the contradictions and carried them like sealed letters in her mind. A man might be quiet and still formidable. A man might stand 1 pace behind and direct the room without ever raising his voice. On the last Thursday of November, she found him at the table before dawn, lamp turned low, copying from a volume bound in cracked brown leather she had never seen in their rooms. At the top of the page was a heading in his hand, on fiduciary abuse and domestic coercion. He closed the book when he realized she was awake and set it beneath the ledger stack with unhurried care. "Tea?" he asked. "Yes." She moved to the stove and set the kettle, aware of him behind her, aware of the narrow room, the rough plaster, the single trunk, still without a proper place, and the thin thread of warmth that had formed between them, not from declarations, but from labour shared under pressure. When she handed him his cup, their fingers touched once, briefly, and the contact was ordinary enough to ignore. Neither of them ignored it. Neither of them ignored it. And because neither spoke of it, the silence settled between them with a new precision that made every ordinary movement feel deliberate. Sienna set her own cup down, reached for the morning docket, and found that Elias had already arranged the pages in the order she preferred. Petitions first, household accounts last. Correspondence waited under the pewter paper knife, so the draft from the window would not disturb her columns. It was a small courtesy. It felt intimate because it asked for no acknowledgement. A knock sounded at the lower door, then boots on the stair. Nora appeared with a folded note on a tray and eyes carefully lowered. "For Mr. Thorne, sir, brought by a boy from East Yard." Elias took the note, thanked her, and broke the seal while standing. Sienna watched his face by habit now, not for drama, but for truth. His expression altered by the smallest degree at the second line. He folded the paper once and set it beside his cup. "We must go to Pelham Court this morning," he said. "The boundary matter will not wait." Sienna held his gaze. And the note? A family concern. His tone was measured, closed. She had learned the difference between privacy and evasion, and this was both. She did not press while Nora remained in the doorway. She rose, tied her cuffs, and gathered the docket case. By noon they had visited 2 tenants, corrected 1 fraudulent fee schedule, and filed a reply to a levy appeal. The day remained bitterly cold, wind pushing grit along the curbstones, but Elias moved through each task with his usual calm authority, speaking little, observing everything. At the second office, a clerk offered condolences before catching himself, and Elias answered with a nod that ended the exchange. Sienna heard the word condolences and said nothing until they were in the carriage hired by the quarter-mile, windows fogging at the corners from their breath. "Your family concern," she said quietly. "Is someone ill?" He looked out at the passing row houses before he answered. "My sister was injured at South Quay Works 3 nights ago. A hoist chain snapped. Her arm was fractured. She cannot return yet." The leather strap of the document case dug into Sienna's palm. Has she care? She has care. She has no wages. Has the works owner accepted liability? A small pause. He has accepted delay. The language told her enough. Denial by procedure, not principle. She turned back to the window, jaw set, and watched rain begin as a faint silver net across the glass. That evening, after they had eaten broth and bread, and Elias had gone out again with 2 affidavits for signature, Sienna opened the lower drawer of her trunk where she kept what remained of her former life. 2 evening gloves too fine for Merrow Street, a dance card she had never thrown away, and a sapphire comb set in filigreed silver. Her mother had given it to her at 17 with no embrace, only instruction not to misplace it. Sienna held it now under lamplight and felt, with uncomfortable clarity, how much coal it could buy, how many legal fees it could cover, how quickly Lenora would call it proof of theft if she learned where it had gone. She closed the drawer, reopened it, and took the comb. By the first week of December, the parish supper had become unavoidable social theatre, one of those evenings where every district grievance was dressed as community spirit and every hierarchy sat in plain view under lamps. Sienna attended because 2 tenancy revisions needed signatures from men who only appeared in public when observed by their peers. She wore her brown dress with a fresh collar. Elias stood beside her at the edge of the long room, plain coat brushed, expression unreadable. Halfway through the meal, Magistrate Pembroke raised his voice just enough to carry across 3 tables. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, smiling at no one in particular, "we are told your husband has become a reformer of leases. Remarkable polish for a stableman's ledger hand." A ripple of restrained amusement moved through the room. Elias did not react. His hand remained on the back of the chair before him, knuckles still. Sienna set down her spoon. "Then you are doubly fortunate, sir," she said, clear and level. "A polished hand that can read your contracts before others sign them." The table went quiet. Pembroke's smile thinned. Elias turned his head toward her, and for one unguarded moment, she saw something in his grey eyes she had not seen before. Not gratitude, not surprise, something fiercer and quieter, as if a line he had expected to hold alone now had two people standing on it. The room recovered. Talk resumed in pockets. After dessert, while men clustered near the hearth and women moved toward the side corridor for wraps, Sienna heard two matrons behind a half-closed door discussing South Key works, with the careless interest reserved for suffering at a distance. "The Thorn girl," one said. "Compensation claim, I hear." "Hopeless," the other replied. "No council of standing will touch a labourer's petition against the Key Syndicate. Their solicitors bury such things before filing." Sienna stood very still until they passed, then walked back into the hall with the same composed step she had used all evening. She did not mention the conversation to Elias on the walk home. The next morning she left before he returned from the print office, telling Nora only that she had account errands and might miss midday tea. She carried the sapphire comb wrapped in linen, 3 household coins, and a folded page listing the address of a jeweller on Finch Row who asked few questions when paid for discretion. The jeweller turned the comb under magnifying glass, testing clasp and stones with practiced indifference. "It is a family piece," he said. "Value is in provenance. You have no papers." "I have no interest in provenance." He named a figure less than half its worth. Sienna felt heat rise at the back of her neck, then settle. She thought of a fractured arm, suspended wages, a claim everyone called unwinnable. She nodded once. "Count it." He did. She signed no name in his ledger, only initials, and took the coins in a leather purse that felt heavier than it should. Outside, sleet had begun, sharp against her cheeks. She tucked the purse beneath her cloak and walked 2 streets south to Chambers Lane, where council offices lined the square in soot-dark brick and brass plates. At Hartwell and Brigg she asked for Mr. Corbin Hartwell, advocate in industrial claims. The clerk at the desk looked first at her dress, then at her gloves, then at the purse she set down between them. "Mr. Hartwell is engaged." "I will wait." He started to refuse. She met his eyes and did not move. 10 minutes later, she was shown into a narrow office with law reports stacked to the chair rails and a coal fire burning low. Hartwell himself, silver-haired and impatient, listened while she outlined Ruth Thorne's injury in dates and facts. No embellishment, no plea. "She is your relation?" he asked. "She is my husband's sister." "Your husband seeks this action?" "He does not know I am here." Hartwell sat back. "Retainer alone will not produce judgment. South Key retains very experienced men." "Then retain one more." He regarded her for a long moment, then named his fee. It consumed nearly all the jeweller's money. Sienna untied the purse and counted coins onto his desk in neat stacks, leaving only enough for bread, lamp oil, and the filing tram. "Draft immediately," she said. "Notice to employer by tomorrow, medical statement attached. Wage records subpoenaed." Hartwell's mouth shifted, almost a smile at her command of sequence. "You speak as if you have sat in chambers." "I have sat in ledgers." He rang for his clerk. As the papers were brought in, Sienna signed authorization as spouse and financial guarantor, then requested a copy of every filing. She took the receipt, folded it into her reticule, and stood. When she stepped into the corridor, voices drifted from the upper gallery where visitors sometimes waited for hearings to begin. She did not look up. She was already calculating what she would cut from the month's expenses, how long she could postpone coal without freezing Nora's room, which debts could absorb delay. She crossed the courtyard and vanished into the grey afternoon, unaware of the figure at the gallery rail who watched until she turned the corner. Elias said nothing about it that night. He returned late, shook rain from his coat, and handed her a docket for review as if nothing had altered. Yet he was quieter than usual, and once, while she totaled grain invoices, she felt his gaze rest on her left hand, where the sapphire comb had once anchored her hair on formal evenings. The pins now were plain brass. 3 days passed before the first letter from Hartwell arrived for Ruth Thorne, copied to household address by clerical error. Sienna intercepted it at the stair. Formal notice served. Employer response due in 7 days. She set the letter by Elias's plate at supper. He read it once, then again, and looked up. You retained counsel. Yes. With what funds? My own. His gaze went to her hair, then back to her face. The room held still around them, the crack of the stove, the faint sounds from the shop below. That comb was yours, he said. It was useful, she replied. A muscle moved in his jaw. You sold it for my sister. For a lawful claim. He set the letter down with extraordinary care, as if abrupt movement might break something neither of them wished named. Thank you, he said at last, voice low and controlled. She will not forget this. Sienna reached for the bread knife. It was not done to be remembered. No, he said. It was done because you saw her. That night she lay awake long after the fire fell to ash, listening to the street settle. She had not asked for gratitude and did not want it. Yet the knowledge that he had understood the act exactly as she intended it left a quiet ache in her chest that sleep did not quickly soften. By the second week of December, the winter assembly invitations went out, and despite withdrawn courtesies and strained alliances, Dawson House issued one to Mrs. and Mr. Thorne in Lenora's precise hand. Declining would be read as weakness. Attending would be a spectacle. Sienna dressed in dark green silk altered from an older gown and wore no sapphire in her hair. The assembly rooms blazed with chandeliers, mirrors doubling every movement into theatre. Music from the small orchestra drifted above talk that never fully quieted, a constant rustle of judgment disguised as conversation. Lenora received near the central staircase in silver satin, composed, impeccable and very slightly amused. When Sienna and Elias approached, Lenora let her gaze travel once over Sienna's altered gown, pause at the plain hairpins, and return to her face. "My daughter," she said to the nearest cluster, tone light enough to cut. "Our household cautionary tale. So determined, so educational." A few smiles quickly hidden. A gentleman looked away into his glass. Elias shifted one step nearer Sienna, but did not speak. Sienna inclined her head as if introduced at any ordinary call. "Good evening, Mother." Lenora's attention had already moved to another guest. For an hour, Sienna performed the required circuit. Greetings to women who had dropped her cards, acknowledgements to men who discussed grain tariffs while measuring scandal, polite refusals of inquiries framed as concern. Her spine remained straight. Her left hand, resting on her fan, trembled only once when a former friend asked whether life above a failed shop had improved her moral character. Near midnight, she stepped toward the conservatory corridor for air, the crush of perfume and candle heat pressing against her temples. Frost feathered the glass panes. Beyond them, the courtyard lay in brittle moonlight. She paused beside a half-open door when she heard Elias's voice from the adjoining palm room, quiet and unmistakable. An older man answered him, words blurred by distance. Then Elias, clearer. "Not yet," She must believe the fight is hers. Sienna's fingers tightened on the iron latch until cold bit through her glove. The sentence entered her like winter water, swift and absolute, reaching places already tender from months of measured trust. Must believe, not know, believe. Every argument at breakfast, every deference phrased as respect, every yielded point that had made room for her voice could be reassembled now into another design, one in which she had been guided while calling it choice. She did not move for several breaths. Her pulse beat hard at the base of her throat. Glass reflected her face back at her, composed from a distance, colour drained at the mouth. Inside the palm room, a chair scraped. She stepped away before the door opened, crossed the corridor with even pace, and returned to the ballroom as if she had found nothing but air. Ilias located her near the musicians 10 minutes later. "You are pale," he said. "Shall we leave?" She met his eyes and found no obvious deceit, only concern held in restraint, which hurt more than if he had looked evasive. "In a moment," she said. He studied her, then nodded. She lasted 12 more minutes, spoke to 2 matrons, thanked a host she did not like, and accepted her cloak from a footman who avoided her gaze. In the carriage home, she kept her hands folded in her lap, so he would not see the tremor return when the wheels struck ruts. Elias asked once whether she was chilled. She answered that she was tired. Upstairs, she removed her gloves carefully, finger by finger, and set them beside the ledger stack. The room was exactly as they had left it that afternoon. 2 cups on the table, docket tied in blue ribbon, lamp wick trimmed. Nothing looked altered. Everything was altered. When Elias reached for the kettle, she said, without raising her voice, "Do not explain tonight." He stopped with his hand on the handle. "Sienna." "Not tonight." The words were quiet, final for the hour. He withdrew his hand and stood very still, then inclined his head once, in formal assent. She took up the Monday note that had arrived before the assembly and read the familiar line in Lenora's hand. "You will petition for annulment. Your allowance remains suspended until compliance." She folded it into a smaller square than usual and placed it under the paperweight, then sat at the table and opened a blank page in the household ledger. Her pen hovered above the first line while the fire settled, and the man across from her kept silence she had not asked for before, and would not accept unquestioned again. Sienna kept the pen above the blank ledger page until the nib trembled, then lowered it and wrote the date in a hand so controlled it looked like copying rather than decision. Across from her, Elias remained standing near the kettle, not touching it, his silence shaped to the boundary she had set. The fire made a low, settling sound in the grate. Street noise had thinned to late wheels and the occasional call from the key road. She turned the page and began another list on scrap paper, this one not for household accounts. Filing fee, affidavit copies, registry stamp, witness attestation if required. The words came quickly, as if they had already been waiting. He spoke only once. "Will you sleep?" She did not look up. "No." He accepted that answer without argument, moved to the window table and opened a folio as though work were still possible at this hour. She could feel him there 2 paces away, a quiet that had once steadied her and now required interpretation. Not threat, not safety, not yet either. By 2:30 she had balanced the week's figures, separated the coins by use, and calculated what remained if she paid court fees before bread. It was enough to file and not enough to ride. She took the muslin purse, untied it, and counted aloud under her breath. At the 4th stack, her voice roughened. She stopped, swallowed, and finished in silence. Then she stood. The trunk opened with a scrape against the floorboards. She packed one bag in practical order. 2 shifts, stockings, a comb with 3 missing teeth, her winter shawl, the receipt from Hartwell, copies of Lenora's weekly notices, and the unsigned annulment petition she had kept, folded in Hulbridge's precise creases. At the last moment she added a small loaf wrapped in paper, and the pewter pencil she used for figures in the market. She left the green assembly gown hanging behind the door. She left the silver-backed brush she had never liked. She left everything that belonged to the life others had curated for her. Elias closed his folio. "Where are you going?" "Chancery first." "At this hour?" "At opening." He came nearer, careful, as if approaching a frightened horse was the closest language available for this kind of moment. "Sienna, filing without counsel." "Filing without permission." His jaw tightened, then eased. "Then I will come." "No." She fastened the bag and set it by the door. "If I walk in beside you, it will be your strategy again. I require one act that is undeniably mine." His eyes held hers, grey and intent, and for a breath she thought he would overrule her by sheer force of certainty. He did not. He stepped back. "What petition?" he asked. "To terminate my mother's financial guardianship and compel a full accounting of Dawson transfers executed since my marriage." "That is not a minor filing." "I am aware." He looked toward the table where Lenora's latest Monday note sat under the paperweight. "You may trigger immediate retaliation. She has already begun." The words hung between them, clean and irreversible. He reached into his coat, removed a key ring, and set one small brass key on the edge of the table. "My document case," he said. "Top shelf, left cupboard. There is a precedent digest on fiduciary abuse. Take it." She did not touch the key. "No more hidden shelves, Mr. Thorne." A beat passed. Then he closed his hand around the key again and returned it to his pocket. "As you decide," he said. When she left before dawn, the sky over Merrow Street had not yet turned. Frost filmed the apothecary sign and made the steps slick under her boots. Nora, wrapped in a shawl by the kitchen door, tried to offer tea. Sienna pressed her hand once and declined. She crossed the street with the bag on her shoulder and the muslin purse tucked inside her glove, walking fast enough to keep warm and not fast enough to appear chaste. At Chancery Lane, a line had already formed outside the clerk's entrance. Tradesmen with fee disputes, a widow with 2 children clinging to her skirt, a man in a threadbare coat carrying rolled maps. No one looked at anyone else for long. The porter opened the door at 8 and admitted them in order. Sienna stood beneath a soot-dark beam and watched her breath fade as she waited. At the filing desk, the clerk took her papers, skimmed the first page, and lifted his brows. "Mrs. Thorne, is it? Petition against maternal trustee authority." He glanced up, assessing dress, bag, gloves worn at the fingertips. "Do you submit through counsel?" "I submit in my own name. The court prefers formal representation for estate matters of this size." "The court may prefer many things. It will stamp what is properly filed." He cleared his throat, perhaps to rebuke, perhaps to hide surprise, and turned to the fee chart. Initial filing, supplemental copy, and registry indexing. He named the amount. She untied her purse and paid in stacks she had counted hours earlier. Coins struck wood with a small, humiliating clarity. By the final coin, her palm was damp with cold and effort. The clerk blotted the receipt, pressed the seal, and slid the stamped petition back across the desk. "Hearing date pending docket load. Notice will be posted to the address listed. Post a copy to Dawson House as respondent office." "That can be done." She took the papers, folded them into her bag, and stepped aside for the next petitioner. Outside, sunlight had begun to leak along the upper windows, pale and uncommitted. She stood on the curb and counted what remained in her glove. 2 small coins. Not enough for carriage, barely enough for bread and ink. She put them away and began to walk. By noon, her feet ached through the soles, and the strap of the bag had worn a line into her shoulder. She crossed from Chancery toward Chambers Lane, through streets busy with clerks on luncheon errands, and messengers carrying tied packets under waxed cloth. Twice she nearly turned back to Merrow Street, not from fear, but from the fatigue of having already done the hardest thing. Each time she saw Lenora's sentence in her mind as if it were written on glass. A year of discomfort will correct her. She kept moving. Elias's private chambers occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building with a brass plate she had never been invited to read. J. E. Thorne, Advocate. The title sat in afternoon light with severe calm. She stopped at the foot of the stair long enough to feel her pulse in her wrists, then climbed. A junior clerk looked up from a side desk when she entered the outer room. Ink, leather, and coal smoke thickened the air. "Madam, I am here for Mr. Thorne. Has he expected—" The clerk saw her face and abandoned the question. "Yes, you may go in." She did not knock. She opened the inner door and stepped into a room lined with law reports, 2 windows overlooking the lane, and a large desk covered in ordered stacks. Elias stood at the far shelf with his back half turned, removing his gloves. He set them down when he saw her bag. "Sienna." She closed the door behind her, crossed to the desk, and took off her wedding band. The skin beneath was pale where gold had rested all year. She set the ring on the blotter between 2 sealed briefs and held his gaze. "No more omissions, sir." He did not reach for the ring. His expression did not fracture, but something unguarded moved behind it. An exhaustion, perhaps, or relief with sharp edges. He came around the desk and stopped within arm's reach, close enough that she could see the faint ink stain on his right thumb. "You filed," he said softly. "Yes." "In your own name?" "Yes." A brief nod. "Good." The word unsettled her more than opposition would have. She looked past him then because stillness needed somewhere to land, and saw what the room had kept plain all along. On the wall beside the bookcase hung a framed parchment. Inner Temple, Bachelor of Laws, Jonathan Elias Thorne, LL.B. Beneath it, in narrower frame, a call certificate with the same name and date. On the desk corner stood a sealed letter bearing the crest of Merrow, 3 sheaves and a stag, opened and weighted under a paper knife. The first line remained visible. To Jonathan Elias Thorne, heir presumptive to the Viscountcy of Merrow. The room tilted, not from surprise alone, but from the speed with which old details reordered themselves. Latin notes in margins, registrars who nearly stood at his entrance, clauses written like architecture, deference offered then disguised. He followed her gaze and did not attempt to block it. "I did not surrender those arguments because I could not win," he said. "I surrendered them because they were already yours." Nothing in his tone sought applause. No flourish, no defensive rhetoric. Only statement. Quiet. Complete. Sienna kept one hand on the desk to steady the tremor that had returned to her fingers. "You let me build a case while withholding the map. I let you build authority no one could later call borrowed. At what cost? At mine, if required." She looked back at the ring on the blotter, a circle of plain gold suddenly too simple for the structure beneath it. "You chose for me. I delayed truth. I did not direct your judgment." "Not always." Her voice stayed level by force. "At the assembly you said I must believe the fight was mine." He did not deny it. "I said it to a barrister who would have treated you as a name on an estate schedule if he knew I was preparing appearance. I needed him careless until filing was complete. Was that sentence for strategy as well? Yes. The answer landed cleanly because it carried no attempt to soften itself. She should have felt only anger. Instead, she felt a more difficult thing, the recognition that he had trusted her strength enough to wager his own standing on it, and distrusted the world enough to hide the wager. Outside, a carriage rattled past and faded. In the outer room, pages turned, a pen scratched, ordinary sounds of legal labour continuing, as if no marriage were being renegotiated one closed door away. Sienna drew a breath and opened her bag. She removed the stamped petition receipt from Chancery and laid it beside the ring. "Hearing will be set when docket allows," she said. "Respondent notice directed to Dawson House." His eyes moved to the seal, then back to her face. For the first time since she had entered, he smiled, small and altered, transforming the reserve she knew into something warmer and more vulnerable. "Then we proceed, Mrs. Thorne," he said. She did not pick up the ring. She did not leave it behind. She stood in the centre of his chambers, between the degree he had hidden and the petition she had filed alone, and answered with the only truth that fit both. "We proceed on record." Sienna heard her own words settle into the room, and for the first time since the winter assembly, she felt ground under her feet that did not move when someone else shifted weight. Jonathan inclined his head once, formal as any advocate acknowledging a filing, then reached for the ring she had left on the blotter and closed his hand around it without putting it away. "Then the first record is complete disclosure," he said. "Mr. Halbridge has been moving Dawson Trust funds through a maintenance account opened in your name and signed under copied authorization. The transfers funded pressure points, withdrawn credit, expedited legal fees, private retainers. I could not allege fraud without direct chain evidence. Mrs. Keats has now entered your grandmother's brooch. Return in inventory, with date, hour, and witness mark. That closes one avenue they had prepared." Sienna set her bag down beside his desk. "He told Mother I had no practical standing. He told many people that. He was wrong in law and useful in delay." He moved to a side cabinet, unlocked it, and drew out a thin packet tied with blue tape, then another bound in red. On the blue packet he had written Lenora's correspondence. On the red, estate transfer schedules. He placed both before her, along with the small brass key he had offered in the night. "I should have given you this key months ago," he said. She looked at the key, then at him. "You should have." He accepted the blow without defense. "Will you take it now?" She took it and set it atop the packets. "On terms." "State them." "No strategic omissions where my name is filed. No protection that requires me ignorant. If you test me again, I walk." His expression did not harden. It opened briefly in that rare way she had seen only in unguarded moments. Agreed. By the following Wednesday, frost had turned to rain and back again, and Chancery listed Dawson versus Thorne guardianship petition for first hearing at 10. Sienna arrived in her brown dress and winter shawl, bag strap cutting across her shoulder in the familiar place. Jonathan walked beside her through the court corridor, but stopped one pace behind when they reached the courtroom doors, allowing the usher to call her name first. Lenora sat at the respondent table in charcoal silk and pearls, posture perfect, boredom arranged like jewellery. Mr. Halbridge stood beside her with 3 document boxes and a face carefully emptied of reaction. He glanced once at Jonathan and looked away too quickly. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Proceedings began with formalities, then narrowed fast. "Mrs. Thorne," said the judge, peering over half-moon lenses, "you allege coercive financial control under maternal trusteeship and unauthorized transfers. Are you represented?" Sienna stood. "Yes, my lord, by Mr. Jonathan Elias Thorne." There was a visible ripple across the solicitor benches, a soft intake, a whisper cut short. On the far side, the older barrister from the assembly leaned back with his mouth tightening, as recognition arrived too late to help him. Jonathan rose, voice steady and spare. "For petitioner, my lord." Lenora's gaze slid to him, then to Sienna, and returned to the bench without visible alarm. "My daughter has been indulged in dramatics," she said when invited to respond. "This is domestic disagreement dressed as law." Sienna did not look at her. Jonathan opened with documents, not accusation. Monday notes, each in Lenora's hand, entered and marked. Halbridge memoranda asserting no practical standing, entered and marked. The unsigned annulment petition prepared before any inquiry and repeated under financial duress, entered and marked. Then the transfer schedules, columns of figures moving through accounts labelled household stabilization, social maintenance, and discretionary correction. The courtroom quieted as numbers replaced opinion. Mr. Halbridge objected on foundation. Jonathan supplied foundation. He called Mrs. Keats, who arrived with keys at her waist and Dawson inventory ledger under her arm. She testified to the brooch return, the date, the witness signature, and the standing instruction from Lenora to notify any attempted sale of family pieces before purchase completion. Halbridge tried to narrow her answer. She repeated it unchanged. When Lenora took the stand, she remained composed. "A year of discomfort will correct her," Jonathan read from Halbridge's attendance notes. "Did you speak this sentence?" "I spoke of structure." "Did you suspend all credit access to your married daughter's address?" "Yes." "Did you direct weekly annulment notices as a condition of restoring allowance?" "I directed reasonable terms." He paused, then placed one additional sheet before the clerk. "And these copied signatures authorizing trust transfers in petitioner's name. Did petitioner sign them in your presence?" Lenora's fingers tightened once on the rail. Mr. Halbridge managed procedural necessities. The judge's eyes lifted. "That is not an answer." "No," Lenora said after a measured beat. "She did not sign in my presence." The silence after that was brief and absolute. Before noon, the court recessed for orders. In the corridor, Sienna stood by the high window with rain stippling the glass. A familiar silver-haired figure approached, hat in hand. "Mr. Hartwell." "Mrs. Thorne," he said with a small bow that held none of his earlier impatience. "South Key has agreed to settlement terms for Miss Ruth Thorne. Wage replacement, medical costs, and a safety audit entered by consent this morning. Your retainer receipt is closed." Relief moved through Sienna so sharply she had to press 2 fingers to the window ledge. She accepted. "She instructed me herself at 9. Her arm is healing. She said to tell you she has purchased her own coal for the month and intends to return your kindness with interest." Sienna smiled despite herself. "Tell her to keep her interest." Hartwell's mouth shifted. "I already did." She did not agree. He handed over a folded release copy and took his leave. When court resumed, the judge delivered findings without ornament. Maternal trusteeship terminated. Full accounting ordered under independent auditor. Temporary control of Dawson estate disbursements transferred to petitioner pending final settlement. Unauthorized transfers referred for disciplinary review. Lenora Dawson censured for coercive financial conduct. Halbridge referred to the Law Society panel for signature irregularities and fiduciary breach. Lenora did not look at Sienna as the orders were read. She gathered her gloves, rose, and left by the side door with measured steps. No scene, no plea. Her power simply ceased to function in that room. Outside the courtroom, people who had once spoken over Sienna now moved aside for her to pass. Magistrate Pembroke, waiting on an unrelated matter, removed his hat and said, "Mrs. Thorne." Nothing more. It was enough. 3 days later, at Mrs. Vale's request, Sienna and Jonathan walked Merrow Street at dusk to deliver revised tenancy books. Mrs. Vale pressed warm bread into Sienna's hands and showed her the first receipt, paid under the lawful schedule. Nora met them at the stair with flushed cheeks and announced that a parcel had arrived from South Quay. A scarf knitted one-handed by Ruth in uneven stitches and stubborn pride. Sienna wrapped it around her throat at once. That evening she opened her trunk fully for the first time since the wedding. She removed the unsigned annulment petition and fed it to the fire, watching the prepared language curl and blacken. She placed Lenora's Monday notes, now court-marked exhibits, into a labelled file for the auditor. She tucked Hartwell's settlement release beside household ledgers. The sapphire comb remained absent and unredeemed. She wrote its sale and purpose plainly in the estate reconstruction book and left the line unadorned. The sacrifice would not be hidden, and it would not be romanticized. By the end of that week, she entered Dawson House through the front doors, with her own key and no announcement. Staff lined the hall in uncertain silence until she asked for names where she had gaps, thanked those who remained, and instructed that wages delayed during the dispute were to be paid before any parlour refurbishment. In the study she found the same dark desk, the same winter light, the same smell of wax and paper that had once accompanied dismissal. Jonathan stood in the doorway, coat still damp from the drive, a stack of household ledgers in his arms. He crossed the room and set them before her with deliberate care. "These are current accounts," he said. "Merrow Street tenancies, Dawson agricultural leases, legal expenses, settlement projections. They are yours to direct." She rested her palm on the top ledger. "Stay." His gaze held hers, searching for condition. "As my husband," she said, "not my strategist." Something eased in his face then, a quiet release she felt more than saw. He placed her ring on the ledger beside her hand and waited. Sienna looked at the ring for a long moment, then slid it back onto her finger. It fit as it always had, plain gold warmed by skin, altered only by what it now represented. At the study window, rain began again, light on the glass. In the hall below, staff moved with the brisk rhythm of a household returned to lawful order. Sienna opened the first ledger, turned to a blank page, and began dictating payments while Jonathan took his seat across from her, not ahead, not behind, and wrote exactly as she directed.